Welcome back to Founding Chronicles, your home for untold stories from America's past. Before we dive in, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe, and hit that bell icon so you never miss a story. Today, we uncover a chilling tale from 1872, the story of Edwin Grayson, better known as the Marble-Eyed Boy, America's youngest notorious criminal. A child with eyes as cold as stone who turned the streets of Boston into his playground of fear and fascination. Let's step back in time and see how a boy, barely 13, outwitted a city and became a legend. The year was 1872, and the streets of Boston hummed with a restless energy. Gas lamps flickered along narrow cobblestone alleys, casting long shadows that danced like restless ghosts across the brick walls. The air carried the scent of coal smoke, horse manure, and the faint tang of the harbor's salt. Here, in a city that prided itself on order and propriety, chaos often lingered just beyond the reach of the law. It was in this world of stark contrasts, between wealth and want, respectability and crime, that Edwin Grayson first emerged, a boy whose face would be etched into the nightmares of Boston's citizens for years to come. Edwin was just 12 years old, yet there was something in his marble-colored eyes, pale, unblinking, impossibly cold, that made grown men uneasy. He moved through the crowded streets with the quiet confidence of someone who understood human weakness better than most adults ever would. He wore tattered clothing, his shoes worn thin from endless wandering. Yet he carried himself with an air of calculation, a precocious intelligence that seemed far beyond his years. Many in his neighborhood whispered that he wasn't like other boys. He didn't laugh at the common jokes. He didn't cry when hurt, and he didn't flinch at the harsh realities that surrounded him. His life had been a hard one, shaped by the cruel indifference of the city's underbelly. Edwin's father had been a drunkard who vanished one winter night, leaving the boy and his mother to fend for themselves in a cramped tenement. His mother, worn thin by illness and poverty, did what she could, but there was never enough food, never enough warmth, never enough safety. By the time Edwin was 10, he had learned to steal, not out of malice, but out of necessity. And yet, necessity soon turned into something darker, something that twisted the boy's ingenuity into a dangerous cunning that would shock the city. It began, innocently enough, in the marketplaces. Edwin would slip his small hands into pockets, lift coins from unguarded purses, and vanish before anyone could catch him. The vendors would grumble, blaming each other, never imagining that the culprit was a boy so small, so unassuming. But even these petty thefts carried a sense of artistry. He studied people, memorized routines, and learned how to manipulate attention, all without the twitch of a nervous muscle. Then came the first real crime, the one that would mark the beginning of his notoriety. On a rain-slicked evening in March, a wealthy merchant returning home from the docks was waylaid in a dark alley. His pockets were rifled, his money gone, and his cries echoed through the narrow streets. Witnesses reported seeing a figure dart between shadows, moving like a phantom. When the authorities arrived, they found no sign of struggle, no trace of a grown thief. And yet, whispers soon spread. It was the Marble-Eyed Boy. The city's newspapers, broadsheets ink-stained and eager for sensation, seized on the story. Headlines screamed about a young fiend preying on Boston's wealthy, a boy whose age belied the audacity of his crimes. Police detectives were baffled, their methods outdated against someone who seemed to anticipate their every move. Officers would set traps in alleys, shadow him from a distance, but he always vanished like mist, leaving behind only the lingering fear of the next encounter. At school, if you could call it that, Edwin was silent. His teachers tried to teach him, to coax some spark of innocence from the boy, but he sat in the corner, observing, listening, and learning in ways that made even the strictest instructors uneasy. He read faces as easily as books, noticing weakness, desire, and guilt, and he stored these observations for moments when they might serve him. Other children tried to befriend him, but they learned quickly that the marble-eyed boy was not a companion. They were a pawn, and Edwin was a master strategist in games they could barely understand. The people of Boston began to fear him not because of the money he stole, but because of the cold certainty in his eyes. They felt the uncanny impression that he was always a step ahead, always calculating, always watching. Parents kept their children close, merchants hired guards, and police redoubled their efforts. But the boy continued, undeterred. And yet, for all his cunning, Edwin was not heartless. He protected those weaker than himself, sometimes slipping food to street urchins or warning them of dangers he alone could sense. His morality was twisted, yes, but it followed its own strange code. By the summer of 1872, Edwin's reputation had spread beyond the neighborhoods he roamed. There were sightings in Boston's docks, whispers in the taverns, and even letters to the papers speculating on the boy's identity. Some claimed he was an orphan of the Civil War, a child hardened by violence. Others suggested something more sinister, that his mind was beyond redemption, shaped by cruelty rather than circumstance. The authorities, embarrassed and increasingly desperate, offered rewards for information, but no one dared come forward. They feared the boy, or perhaps the boy within him, sharp, calculating, and merciless. Then came the night that would truly change everything. The night of the Thatcher robbery. A wealthy banker, known for his ostentatious carriage rides through Beacon Hill, returned home late, followed by Edwin's ever-watchful gaze. The boy had been tracking him for days, learning his routines, noticing which doors were left unlocked, which servants were lazy or inattentive. Under the cover of darkness, Edwin struck. The banker's safe was emptied, his personal letters stolen, and his entire household left in disarray. Yet no one saw a figure. There was no evidence, no footprints save for the small, almost invisible ones that might have belonged to any child in the neighborhood. The next morning, the city erupted. Newspapers screamed of a preteen criminal so daring, so cold, that Boston itself seemed under siege. Crowds gathered outside the banker's home, whispering about the marble-eyed boy. Detectives convened, desperate to capture him, but they were chasing a ghost. And Edwin, perched on the rooftops or hiding in shadowed alleys, observed them all with a chilling detachment. In those early months, Edwin was not just a thief. He was a phenomenon, a mirror reflecting the city's anxieties back at it. He challenged authority, mocked the wealthy, and reminded everyone that the streets belonged to no one, not the police, not the merchants, not even the city itself. And yet, beneath the growing legend, there was a boy still struggling with hunger, fear, and loneliness. A boy whose marble eyes saw the world with a clarity that others could not comprehend, but whose heart had yet to decide where it would stand. It was a precarious existence, balanced between brilliance and disaster, cunning and innocence. Edwin Grayson was becoming more than a criminal. He was becoming a symbol. And in the shadows of 1872 Boston, the city itself began to realize that it had created a monster, or perhaps it had simply uncovered a truth about the darkness that lurked in all its streets. By the summer of 1872, Boston had transformed in subtle yet unmistakable ways. The ordinary rhythm of life, the clatter of carriage wheels, the cries of street vendors, the laughter of children in alleyways, was punctuated by whispers of fear. Adults crossed streets to avoid dark corners, merchants barred their doors before nightfall, and law enforcement found itself stretched thin, chasing shadows and rumors. In every neighborhood, the legend of the marble-eyed boy grew, fed by sightings that might have been imagination, and crimes that seemed impossible for a child to commit. Edwin Grayson, now 12 and a half, thrived in the city's uncertainty. He had learned to move not just with stealth, but with strategy. Where a normal thief might strike once and flee, Edwin studied patterns, mapped streets in his mind, and anticipated movements. He had begun to understand the human heart in ways that made adults uneasy. He knew how to read fear, and he knew how to manipulate it. Sometimes he would leave small tokens of his presence, an overturned bucket, a scrawled mark on a door frame, just enough to provoke anxiety without revealing his identity. It was as if he were playing a game, but the stakes were life and property, not merely amusement. One of his earliest schemes of this new phase began with a small jewelry shop on Milk Street. The owner, a stout man with a quick temper, prided himself on keeping a tight ledger and a tight shop. Edwin watched him for days, noting the routines of the apprentices, the times the shopkeeper's gaze wandered, and the way customers distracted him with questions. One rainy evening, the boy slipped inside through a back window left slightly ajar, moved with a precision that seemed almost mechanical, and emptied the till. The shopkeeper discovered the loss the next morning and was dumbfounded, not merely at the missing coins, but at the absolute absence of any sign of forced entry. In whispered corners, people began to talk about the boy who moved like a ghost, whose eyes betrayed nothing, and whose age made the crime even more horrifying. But Edwin's ambitions extended beyond petty theft. He began to crave notoriety, drawn not by greed, but by the intoxicating power of control. One night, he overheard a group of young laborers in a tavern boasting about a shipment of imported goods arriving at the docks. The men laughed carelessly, certain that no child could ever touch such riches. Edwin, perched on the roof of a nearby warehouse, listened, memorized, and planned. When the shipment arrived under the cover of darkness, the crates were ransacked, and goods, fine silks, spices, and delicate glassware vanished without a trace. The laborers' shouts echoed down the wharf, but by the time anyone arrived, Edwin was gone, slipping between alleys like a phantom. Even as his crimes grew bolder, Edwin displayed a strange, paradoxical morality. He often avoided harming those who could not fight back. Street urchins, stray animals, even certain elderly shopkeepers found small gifts mysteriously left on doorsteps, coins, bread, or notes with scrawled warnings. It was as if the boy understood the delicate balance of fear and sympathy, of terror and fascination. This complexity made him even more unnerving to the people of Boston. He was not merely a criminal. He was an enigma, a child who could inspire dread and, occasionally, hope. The police response intensified. Captain Thorne, a grizzled veteran of the Boston Police Department, was assigned to the case. He had spent decades navigating the city's criminal underworld, tracking pickpockets, smugglers, and confidence men. Yet this boy confounded him. Thorne ordered round-the-clock surveillance, traps in alleyways, and informants planted in tenements. But Edwin seemed always a step ahead. One night, Thorne's officers waited near a wealthy merchant's home, expecting the boy to appear. Hours passed. The night air grew colder, and officers grew restless. Then, just before dawn, the safe was found empty. The boy's footprints, too. Small and too clever, leading nowhere. Thorne cursed himself and the boy alike, realizing that this was no ordinary thief. Amid this rising tension, the boy's legend spilled into the social fabric of Boston. Newspapers sensationalized each event, with stories of the marble-eyed boy appearing on front pages, often accompanied by woodcut illustrations showing a pale-eyed youth slipping through shadows. Families read about him at breakfast. Merchants discussed him at noon, and children whispered his name in alleyways after dark. "He is everywhere," one paper wrote, "and yet nowhere." The fear of being watched, of being outwitted by a child, gnawed at the collective conscience of a city that prided itself on civility. Edwin's own psyche was shifting alongside his reputation. The boy who had once acted out of hunger now began to experiment with audacity. He would taunt the authorities with notes left at crime scenes, riddles scrawled on walls, or coins arranged in patterns that hinted at his next target. The thrill was no longer in survival or even in the spoils. It was in the game itself, in testing the limits of a city unprepared for someone like him. But power, even for a child, comes with consequences. Neighbors began recognizing him on the streets. Rival thieves grew wary, some attempting to track or betray him. And yet, despite the growing network of threats, Edwin's cold marble gaze remained unfazed. He had become a master of disguise and deception, shifting seamlessly from street urchin to harmless messenger, from beggar to observer, always slipping. Between roles, always unseen until it was too late. The turning point came one late August evening, when Edwin targeted the home of Jonathan Whitaker, a wealthy industrialist whose reputation for cruelty made him widely disliked. Whitaker's mansion, perched on the slope of Beacon Hill, was a fortress of iron gates and watchful servants. Most criminals avoided it, knowing the risk outweighed any potential reward. But not Edwin. The boy had studied Whitaker for weeks, noting the hours when the man dined alone, the pattern of the servants' patrols, and the habits of the household dogs. When night fell, Edwin moved. The night of the Whitaker robbery was a symphony of precision. Edwin scaled walls, slipped past guards, and unlocked doors that no adult had ever dared approach. By the time the first alarm was raised, the boy had taken gold, jewels, and sensitive documents that threatened to ruin Whitaker's business dealings if leaked. What made the crime unforgettable, however, was the signature Edwin left behind. A single marble-sized stone, placed deliberately on the central table of the parlor, a silent, mocking calling card. When the household discovered it, the boy was already gone, yet the message was clear. Boston's youngest criminal had reached the apex of daring, and no fortress could contain him. And so the city trembled. Boston's authorities faced not merely a boy who stole, but a symbol of cunning and defiance. Edwin's legend had evolved from a curiosity to an obsession, capturing the imagination of the public and the anxiety of every adult in the city. They whispered that the marble-eyed boy was not a child at all, but something older, something that understood men, money, and fear better than any grown criminal. And for Edwin, perched in shadowed corners, watching the city react, the thrill only deepened. He was not just surviving anymore. He was orchestrating a masterpiece, one theft at a time, weaving terror and fascination into the very streets of Boston. By the fall of 1872, Boston was gripped by a quiet panic. The city's gas-lit streets, once bustling with ordinary commerce and conversation, were now threaded with fear. People hurried home before nightfall, locking doors and shuttering windows, against the boy whose marble eyes seemed to see through walls and souls alike. Each crime Edwin committed was more daring than the last, and the legend surrounding him grew, fed by every whispered rumor, every frantic letter to the newspapers, and every frightened glance cast down a shadowed alley. Edwin, now 13, had become almost mythic. His presence was felt in the smallest thefts and the largest, from the petty robbery of a baker's coin purse to the audacious infiltration of the Whitaker mansion. Each time he struck, he left a mark, a subtle signature, that reminded the city that no corner of Boston was truly safe. Yet the boy's audacity was matched by a growing awareness of his own power. He began to realize that fear could be manipulated as easily as locks could be picked or keys turned. In the whispers of terrified merchants, in the nervous glances of policemen, he found a strange satisfaction, a thrill that rivaled the act of theft itself. The police, desperate and humiliated, were driven to extreme measures. Captain Thorne had now enlisted a small army of detectives, officers, and informants, setting traps throughout the city in an attempt to capture the boy. They stationed men in alleyways, hid behind crates in the marketplace, and even placed bait in the form of coin purses and jewelry. Yet Edwin seemed to anticipate every move. It was as if he could see the city not as a network of streets and buildings, but as a living puzzle. Every patrol, every footstep, every shadow mapped in his mind. He moved with a precision and patience that would have been remarkable in an adult, yet he remained outwardly a boy, small, quiet, and almost invisible. But even as his reputation grew, so too did the dangers surrounding him. Rival gangs began to take notice of the marble-eyed boy. Criminals who had once scoffed at the idea of a child thief now plotted against him, hoping to claim his bounty and his glory. They left notes, threatened witnesses, and attempted to ambush him on the streets, but Edwin was always careful, always calculating, always one step ahead. Yet the tension weighed on him. For the first time, he began to feel the consequences of his own fame. The fear that a single misstep could lead not just to capture, but to permanent harm. It was during one of these tense days that Edwin found himself drawn to a part of Boston he had never explored. The docks at the far end of the harbor. Ships lined the wharves, creaking and swaying in the cold wind, their sails furled and their crews busy with the unloading of goods. Here, Edwin saw both opportunity and danger. The waterfront was a place where men were distracted, drunk, or careless, a perfect environment for a calculated strike. He had been watching for weeks, learning the patterns of the workers, memorizing the times when the gates were left unattended, when guards dozed, when the lanterns flickered. And on this night, with the moon barely visible behind clouds, he made his move. Edwin's plan was daring even for him. A shipment of fine textiles recently arrived from England sat under minimal watch. He had studied every angle, every guard, rotation, and had even constructed makeshift tools from discarded crates and rope. By midnight, he had slipped through the first line of defense, moving silently as a shadow, his marble eyes reflecting the dim lantern light. The crates were heavy, the fabric thick, yet Edwin's small hands worked with surprising strength and finesse. Within an hour, he had removed a significant portion of the shipment and left only subtle signs of his presence. A small, marble-sized stone on the dock, placed deliberately as his calling card. Yet this time, the danger was greater than he anticipated. One of the guards, returning early from a late drink, spotted a flicker of movement. He shouted, alerting the others, and within minutes Edwin found himself surrounded. The boy's usual calm and precision were tested as he calculated every possible escape route. He leapt onto crates, swung from ropes, and disappeared into the fog, leaving the guards shouting and chasing shadows. It was a near miss, one that reminded him, and the city, just how perilous his path had become. The morning newspapers carried dramatic accounts of the heist, painting Edwin as a figure of both admiration and terror. The marble-eyed boy strikes. Again, one headline screamed, while the accompanying story described the astonishing skill and audacity of a child who had bested men twice his age. Public fascination reached a fever pitch. Children whispered his name in alleyways, adults debated the morality of such a young criminal, and even the elite of Boston felt the chill of insecurity. But behind the headlines, the city's authorities were growing desperate. Captain Thorne convened late-night meetings with city officials, merchants, and private detectives. They devised more intricate traps, hoping to lure Edwin into a confrontation. Some suggested that the boy was beyond saving, that he had already crossed into a moral darkness that no guidance or punishment could reverse. Others believed he could be turned, perhaps through fear or clever negotiation, but no plan seemed sufficient. The boy had become not just a criminal, but a symbol of the city's vulnerability, a reminder that even in the post-Civil War era, order was fragile. Amid this growing tension, Edwin himself began to feel an unfamiliar pressure. Though he had evaded capture countless times, he was not invincible. Each near miss, each close encounter with guards or rival thieves left a small mark on his psyche. He began to contemplate the consequences of his actions more seriously, weighing the thrill of audacity against the possibility of permanent confinement. Yet the boy who had once acted solely out of hunger or necessity now craved something far more intoxicating: mastery. He wanted to prove, not to himself alone, but to the city, that he could move undetected, that he could orchestrate events, and that he could wield fear as effectively as any adult. The tension reached its peak one fateful night in late October. Boston's authorities, confident that they had finally learned the boy's habits, set a trap near the harbor, using a decoy shipment of goods. Every guard, every patrol, every lantern was positioned to catch him. But Edwin, perched above the scene on the rooftops, observed the trap with a cold clarity. He saw the men whispering, noticed the faint tremble of fear in their eyes, and realized that his reputation had become a weapon. That night, he struck, but not at the decoy shipment. Instead, he created a distraction that sent the entire city scrambling. He cut ropes, released animals from nearby stables, and set minor fires that drew attention away from his real target. By the time the chaos subsided, Edwin had vanished once more, leaving the city in awe and terror, and Captain Thorne questioning his own competence. And so, by the end of Part 3, Edwin Grayson had become more than a boy or a criminal. He was a legend, a force that manipulated the fears and routines of an entire city, and a symbol of a world in which innocence and menace could exist in the same marble-eyed gaze. Yet even as the city reeled from his audacity, the boy himself stood on a precipice. For all his skill and cunning, one misstep, one mistake, could bring his world crashing down. And in the quiet moments, alone in the shadows, Edwin began to wonder whether the thrill of mastery could truly protect him from the consequences he could no longer ignore. Winter had begun to creep into Boston by December of 1872. The air was cold and sharp, carrying with it the tang of the harbor and the coal smoke that clouded the streets. Cobblestones glistened with ice, and the gas lamps flickered through the early night fog. The city, already weary from months of fear, braced itself. Parents tightened their children's coats, merchants reinforced their doors, and policemen patrolled with heavier footsteps. But one figure moved through it all as if untouched by the season or the growing panic: Edwin Grayson. The marble-eyed boy had become a shadow among shadows, a ghost whose legend now stretched across every corner of Boston. The city's authorities, humiliated and exhausted, devised a final, desperate plan. Captain Thorne, his face lined with age and frustration, gathered a coalition of detectives, merchants, and even private citizens who had suffered from Edwin's thefts. They decided to lure him into a confrontation, a trap so intricate that no single observation or caution could save him. They would use greed, curiosity, and the boy's own obsession with mastery against him. A shipment of gold coins, carefully hidden within a faux cargo crate, was placed at the docks. Guards patrolled every entrance, lanterns burned bright, and rumors of the decoy spread quietly through the underworld, designed to reach the ears of a boy who could not resist a challenge. Edwin, as always, noticed everything. Perched high above on a rickety roof, he observed the guards' rotations, counted lanterns, and calculated distances. He had grown cleverer, more patient, and yet more daring. This was not merely theft. It was a chess game played with human pawns and the city as the board. For weeks, he had been preparing mentally, rehearsing each move, each leap, each escape. He had never failed, and he did not intend to start now. On the night of the trap, Edwin moved with the same precision that had become his trademark. He slipped between shadows, avoiding pools of light, and approached the decoy shipment. Every step was measured, every breath controlled, every heartbeat silent in the foggy night. But this time, there was something different. The air felt heavier, the city itself tense, as if it had been holding its breath for this very moment. The first sign of danger came as a subtle shift, a footstep where none should be, the quiet shuffle of someone repositioning. Edwin froze, calculating. He could still escape, still vanish into the maze of docks, but the knowledge that he was being watched added a pressure he had never truly felt. A subtle panic brushed against the edges of his mind, though his marble eyes betrayed nothing. Then it happened. A trap door swung open beneath him. A net, simple yet effective, snagged his ankle, sending him crashing to the dock below. A collective gasp rose from the hidden observers. The boy struggled, agile and strong, twisting and jerking with all the skill that had kept him free for months. But this time, the city had learned from his audacity. Thick ropes, chains, and firm hands converged, and slowly, inexorably, they brought him under control. Edwin, caught at last, did not scream. He did not cry. His eyes, pale and marble-like, reflected the lanterns above him, the faces of men who had chased him for months, and the harsh reality that his freedom had ended. And yet, even in capture, there was no hint of fear. There was calculation, observation, and an eerie calm, as if he were already planning the next move in a game only he understood. The news of his capture spread through Boston like wildfire. Merchants, parents, and officials celebrated the end of a long nightmare, yet a part of the city could not help but feel a strange loss. Edwin Grayson had been more than a thief. He had been a force, a shadow of challenge against a city that prided itself on order. To see him restrained was relief, yes, but also an unsettling acknowledgement of what they had lost, the confrontation with brilliance untamed, with audacity beyond measure. In the following weeks, the city debated what to do with him. At 13, he was far too young for conventional incarceration in adult facilities, yet too cunning for ordinary juvenile reform. Social reformers, police, and the press argued, each with their own vision for the boy whose crimes had become legend. Newspapers speculated endlessly, printing stories that transformed him into a symbol, sometimes of danger, sometimes of lost innocence, sometimes of a city's failure to understand its own children. Edwin's life in confinement was a quiet storm. He had time now, time to reflect, to examine his actions, and perhaps to understand the consequences that had always loomed in the periphery of his daring escapades. And yet, even as he sat in his small cell, the marble eyes observed everything. The guards' routines, the habits of visitors, the weaknesses in the walls themselves. He had been caught, yes, but his mind remained unbound, a restless force that no chains could truly contain. Over the years, the story of the marble-eyed boy took on a life of its own. Bostonites spoke of him in hushed tones, of a child whose cleverness had both terrified and fascinated an entire city. Children dared each other to imitate his feats. Merchants and police whispered warnings to newcomers, and newspapers occasionally revived the legend, reminding the world that genius and audacity sometimes come in the most unexpected forms. Edwin Grayson became a cautionary tale, a symbol of the unpredictable force of youth, intelligence, and the thin line between innocence and danger. Yet in private, those who had known him in the streets, beggars, vendors, and stray children, spoke of him differently. They remembered the boy who had shared bread, warned them of danger, and moved with a strange moral code that existed beyond the understanding of adults. To them, Edwin was not merely a criminal. He was a reflection of the world around him, a world where survival demanded cunning, and where the strongest sometimes came in the smallest forms. And so the marble-eyed boy's story ended, at least for the public with his capture. But the legend endured, echoing through Boston's alleys, docks, and markets. It was a story of a child who had defied expectation, a city that had underestimated him, and the curious power of one small figure to reshape the perception of an entire society. In the quiet of a prison cell, Edwin Grayson remained unbroken, his marble eyes still reflecting the world, still observing, still waiting. The city may have captured the boy, but it had not captured the legend, and in that enduring shadow the marble-eyed boy remained forever notorious.